So I was very struck by, in the 1950s, the mayor of Nagasaki, I think also the Archbishop, on tours to the US to discuss partnering up with the city of St. Paul in Minnesota.
Yeah.
They made comments to American journalists, and one of those that's repeated by the US press is that we don't do what Hiroshima does. We don't use the nuclear holocaust to play politics.
And fundraise for the city.
And fundraise and all those kinds of things. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more of the context of that
perhaps
kind of comparison.
part of the explanation for that difference may be that in Hiroshima you have a military history to sort of, in a sense, erase. The identity of Hiroshima has to be sort of remade afresh after the war. Because its identity before and during the war was very much as a command center for the Japanese military and a logistical center and so forth. Whereas with Nagasaki, like many cities, particularly in Kyushu, yes, it had a very important military function during the war, but it also had a very, very complex history. Over several hundred years as a centre, in fact, in the pre-Meiji era, the centre for international exchanges between Japan and the outside world, and in particular Holland, which is the sort of conduit for Western goods and knowledge into Japan, and China.
So that raises interesting questions of whether countries like the Netherlands provided aid for the reconstruction of the city. Do we know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that. I think there may well have been Dutch involvement in the reconstruction of the Dejima settlement, which was Dejima being this artificial island that was constructed in Nagasaki harbour for the Dutch to live on, so that they were basically quarantined and prevented from sort of contaminating Japanese society.
Was that damaged in the war?
Part of that idea of contamination being related to religion, Christianity, from the.
And was that area damaged during the war?
Well, I think the remains of the Dutch.
Because Nagasaki suffered bombing before the atomic bomb?
Yeah, yes, it would have. To be honest, I don't know. I think actually before the atomic bomb was dropped, Nagasaki had not been particularly heavily bombed, but I couldn't swear to that.
Because there was heavy air raids in the 6 months leading up to the atomic bomb.
I mean, Fukuoka, for example, was firebombed,
right?
Like many Japanese cities. So Fukuoka actually was pretty badly devastated. The atomic bombings were, if you like, the most spectacular forms of bombing, but they were not necessarily the most destructive. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than the bombings of Hiroshima and
Nagasaki. That's interesting in itself in terms of international memory as well, that Hiroshima's captured that sense of obliteration in a way.
But for understandable reasons.
Of course. But that's statistically also important, because so much importance now is put on the numbers. So there seems to be the quantification of this, and the research that's going into that to establish the total numbers is something that China, Japan are investing a lot of effort into.
It's nice that you say research in that sense. I mean, sometimes you wonder, certainly in terms of...
But we've seen documentation centres and research.
Oh yes, absolutely. But the figures, the numbers become a kind of part of this global memory competition, obviously.
Yes, and it's interesting what you were saying, I hadn't realised before, about the figures for the numbers of victims in Hiroshima, which were given as how many?
Depending on how they measure it.
So
300,000 was a figure.
So you're dealing with a figure that's very similar to the figure which in recent years has been emblazoned all over the Nanjing Massacre Memorial.
Which is 300,000.
Which may be part of a sort of competition to demonstrate the equivalence of those
scales.
Yeah. But, I mean, to get back to the point about the sort of histories and identities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, I think in the case of Hiroshima, the post-war identity of the city is really very much centred on the bombing, and that's it. Whereas with Nagasaki, there's the bombing, but there's also the role of the city as a sort of international hub in pre-Meiji Japan. There's the Christian heritage of the city, which of course has become wrapped up with the bombing, but has a much longer history and is distinctive to Nagasaki. And Nagasaki today retains strong links with China, also actually with Holland. So I was mentioning there's a huge Dutch-themed reconstructed tourist town north of Nagasaki called Huis ten Bosch, which is a very big tourist attraction
for Japanese.
Japan. Yeah.
So in those ways, those memories haven't been crowded out.
They have
more plural
history, not in the way that the memories of pre-war Hiroshima have, because I think partly because the memories of pre-war Hiroshima are
so bound up with that military,
much more sensitive.
But also it being
post-war Japan,
being the first atomic bomb. I think that's significant. It's like the first man on the moon.
That is significant.
I think it is, isn't it? For some peculiar reason.
Yeah. But I mean, definitely the military history of pre-war Hiroshima. You talk about that, you have to talk about the wars that Japan was engaged in. You have to deal with all that difficult history much more directly. And so, focusing on the bombing, the post-war mission of Hiroshima to preach peace around the world as a result of that's
I think once again we're discovering, I mean, again I say I began this project thinking in terms of post-Cold War, post-1989, sudden global connections that are shaping these memoryscapes, and more realising that this is always a feature, certainly in post-war
transnational connections.
These transnational, these international pressures, these international shapings, these domestic, this comparison of how this city as second,
and also grassroots movements,
and their transnational links, and really that post-89 watershed is something we're starting to question.
Well, and the grassroots movements here, as we've seen in the Oka Masaharu memorial, the little private memorial, were bound up with Christianity. I mean, in that case, he was a Protestant.
Again, those networks.
Preacher. And that's not something that's so present in Hiroshima.
It
doesn't have that Christian heritage.